Hello, good evening, and welcome to our 130th step in our walking tour through the Bible. And here we get to the first book of the Maccabees. And I have to say that it is quite hard going, the book of the Maccabees. It's read in church quite frequently, but the lectionary just gives us edited highlights. So it cuts out a lot of the repetition. It doesn't repeat itself, but so many of the passages are reminiscent of other passages. The book of the Maccabees has some interesting facts about it, I have to say. I'm thinking today just about the first 9 chapters up to the death of Judas Maccabeus. First of all, it's the same old story of the fight to preserve the purity of the faith. Now, that's why it's interesting to us as Christians. Essentially, the Jews are now under the yoke of the Hellenists, that is to say, what are called the successor kingdoms to Alexander the Great. And Antiochus Epiphanes decides, in his mad way, that the Jews have to be assimilated by force. And this leads to a terrible persecution. Then Mattathias doesn't like this. He refuses to sacrifice to the pagan gods, and he falls upon his oppressors and kills them, whereupon they flee to the hills and a revolt breaks out. This revolt goes on rather a long time, and eventually, by the 9th chapter, it's failed because Mattathias is dead and his son, Judas Maccabeus, is killed in battle in a terrible defeat, although there have been lots of victories along the way. So what's all this tell us? Well, first of all, it tells us that true faith is always a danger from the world. It's telling us this really quite fairly, and it's true what it's telling us. If you think the world is your friend, you are mistaken. The world is not your friend, the world is your enemy if you're a believer in God. And so Antiochus Epiphanes tries to destroy all copies of the law that he can. He has women who have their sons circumcised killed and their babies hung round their necks, and so on. He builds a gymnasium in Jerusalem, and so on. He sets up the abomination of desolation on the altar of the holy place in Jerusalem. One of the things that Judas Maccabeus does is, of course, when they're winning, when the Jewish people are winning against their oppressors, they reconsecrate the temple, they purify the temple, and this is the foundation of the Jewish feast of Hanukkah, which is still celebrated today. So we've got to ask ourselves, are we totally committed to keeping our faith pure? Or are we syncretists? Now, actually, that's not really the way to go about it. I don't think any of us would admit to being syncretists. None of us really would say, oh, well, anything as crass as the church needs to keep with the modern world and we need to change certain doctrines. The only people who say that are people who are non-religious. Generally, they'll say, oh, the Catholic Church needs to bring itself up to date, etc. It's got to throw out of the window all these doctrines that are holding people back or making the church look ridiculous and so on. Doctrines as it's received, of course, from Jesus Christ. They've got to be rubbished and thrown away. And of course, that way, more people will want to come to church and religion will be really popular. In fact, the opposite happens. The more liberal, the more in keeping with the spirit of the age the church becomes, the less people are interested in the church, The more the church stands against the spirit of the age and the errors of the spirit of the age, the more the church is attractive, particularly to young people. That seems to me a most obvious point. And indeed, if you look at the way certain Christians have compromised with the spirit of the age, it's led to disaster. And of course, those sort of Christians are foreshadowed in the book of Maccabees by the renegades, men who came out of Israel and said, come on, it's time to modernize, the ones who somehow or another, let's not ask how they quite did this, disguised their circumcision and became like the Gentiles. These people are on a hiding to nothing. These people are, in fact, the death of Israel, not the updating of Israel, the death of Israel. And indeed, even today, I think it's true to say, many Jewish people do assimilate and cease to be Jewish, just as many Christians assimilate and cease to be Christians. We've got to keep our powder dry. We've got to stay faithful to the law and to the tradition that we have inherited. Whether you're Jewish or whether you're Christian, whether you're Catholic or whether you're Protestant, keep to the tradition. Now, the the book of Maccabees also has some other interesting sort of things about it. Clearly, the author has read other books. Well, you'd expect that. But the author wants to give a certain amount of verisimilitude to the battle scenes, for example. So, for example, chapter 9, the Battle of Beerzaith, when Judas Maccabeus is killed, we're told that the army marched out of camp and drew up facing the enemy. Well, yeah. The cavalry was drawn up in 2 squadrons. The slingers and the archers marched in the van of the army, and the best fighters were put in the front rank. Bacchides, that's the enemy general, was on the right wing. The phalanx, technical terms there, the phalanx advanced from between the 2 squadrons. Squadron, technical term as well. Sounding the trumpets. The men on Judas's side also blew their trumpets, and the whole earth shook with the noise of the armies. The engagement lasted from morning until evening. Judas saw that Bacchides and the main strength of his army lay on the right. All the stout-hearted men rallied to him, and they crushed the right wing, pursuing them as far as the Azara hills. But when the Syrians on the left wing saw that the right had been broken, they turned and followed hot on the heels of Judas. Well, hey, we've got a pincer movement in progress here. Now, I don't know if this was written by an eyewitness, but it was certainly written by somebody who wanted to give the impression that he was either an eyewitness or relating the testimony of eyewitnesses. He wants to express the battle scene in a way that's intelligible. And actually, he does a good job. It is quite intelligible. You can understand that. Then, say, one side of the army, the fight became desperate. There were many casualties on both sides. Judas himself fell, and the remnant fled. There's some literary quality to this. The remnant fled. They saw that Judas was dead and they fled. It's a good description of a battle. But I think there's so many battles in the book of the Maccabees that it does remind me of a rather dismissive phrase, but a funny one, which I think comes from a novel written by A.N. Wilson about some people going to church, somebody getting up to read, and I quote, a chapter of blood-curdling military history. This is blood-curdling military history. Doesn't seem to be particularly religious to us, but clearly it's very important to our Jewish brethren, because Judas Maccabeus, who dies in battle so heroically, is the man who fights to save the Jewish nation. And if Judas Maccabeus and his brothers and his father had not risen to fight to save the Jewish nation would have ceased to have existed, because the Jewish nation relies on the Torah, the law and the tradition it's received from Moses and it's been passed down to it. So Judas Maccabeus is incredibly important for the Jews. It's also important to us. We've got to remember, and this we go back to another important passage, what happens when the revolt actually breaks out. This is back in the second chapter. No, it's the second chapter. Yes, Mattathias and his sons are invited to sacrifice to the pagan gods. They refuse. They're told, oh, don't worry, you're important, you'll get rewarded, and so on and so forth. But they refuse, and they spark off a war. Now, this happened in England in the 1530s. Obviously, I don't mean it happened, but you know what I mean. People were called in and they said, look here, King Henry wants you to take this oath, or that he is the supreme governor, the supreme head of the church. You've always heard that the Pope was that, but now as from Monday, things are changing and you'll be rewarded for this, and so on. So we're dissolving the monasteries, by the way, and you'll be rewarded with lots of land. And King Henry, you know what he's like when he's upset. And everybody said, yeah, sure. and they all took the oath. Some of them took the oath with their fingers like that behind their backs, but most of them took the oath and said, well, if the king says so, it must be right. Or, oh, well, it's nothing to do with me. Oh, well, I'm not really very religious. Oh, well. And the oath was administered to virtually, well, a very large segment of the population. It included schoolmasters. All parish priests had to take the oath. I think of the parish priests who had to take the oath, there's only one I can think of who refused and was killed by the king. That's the Blessed or the Saint Edmund Jennings, who was parish priest of Isleworth, Middlesex. Again, of the religious orders, they all took the oath, except the Carthusians, who refused to take the oath. And of the important people in the kingdom, St. Thomas More refused to take the oath, was killed. The bishops, St. John of Rochester, refused to take the oath and was executed. The other bishops, they all took the oath. Makes you think, doesn't it? When push comes to shove, self-interest usually wins out. And Mattathias and his sons revolted, but everybody else said, oh, well, it's only a sacrifice. Oh, it's well, I don't know what the Jewish equivalent is of crossing your fingers, saying, therefore, what you're doing doesn't count. But the most of them said, oh, well, we'll get away with it. This happened in the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. He gives us lots of dates, the guy who writes the first book of the Maccabees. So it's happening roughly 200 BC, 150 BC. Not a lot has changed since then. Religion has few heartfelt defenders. And yet, the Maccabees are the ones we celebrate today. St. Thomas More is the one we celebrate today. St. John Fisher is the one we celebrate today. St. Edmund Jennings is the one. The others who took the oath or took whatever oath they were asked. Some of them took several oaths. They changed, they did whatever the king wanted. They are not people we celebrate today. So be on the right side, eh? All the best. Bye.